The discovery was so grotesque that even seasoned deputies had to look away. It was a late afternoon in 1994 when a fisherman trudging through the mangroves of Charlotte County, Florida, spotted what he thought was a wild hog carcass. But as he drew closer, the truth unraveled in horrifying detail: pale, decomposed flesh, wrists still bound with rope, and the unmistakable human face of a man staring blankly at the canopy above. The swamp was heavy with humidity, but the silence was worse. Not a single bird call, not a single rustle, only the sound of boots shifting in the muck as deputies secured the scene. Whoever had left this body had done more than kill. The cuts on the flesh were clean, deliberate, almost surgical. There was no sign of panic or rage. This had been done with patience. The sheriff's office quickly realized they weren't looking at a random act of violence. This was predatory, methodical, a signature of someone who had done it before and who would almost certainly do it again. Detectives began to dig into missing persons reports. The faces of young men filled the board in the sheriff's office: runaways, drifters, estranged sons. The kind of men who slipped through society's cracks. Who could vanish without anyone immediately raising the alarm? A pattern began to emerge: men who had last been seen with a stranger offering money for modeling. That night, as deputies trudged back through the mangroves under the orange Florida sunset, one thought anchored itself in their minds. This wasn't an isolated killing. They had stumbled into the hunting ground of a serial predator, and he was still out there, watching, waiting for his next opportunity. The woods gave up their secrets slowly, but when they did, they were brutal. In 1996, 2 years after the first discovery, a group of teens stumbled upon skeletal remains along a hog trail outside Punta Gorda. The bones were scattered, bleached by the sun, and gnawed by animals. But the marks told the same story: bindings, cuts, the surgical stripping of flesh. By now, detectives weren't debating whether there was a serial killer. They were trying to find him before another man disappeared. And then, a break. A young man walked into the sheriff's office trembling, his eyes darting to every corner of the room as if the monster himself might be waiting there. He told them he had been approached by a stranger in a small car, a middle-aged man who offered him quick cash for nude photos. At first, it seemed harmless, but when the man pulled out ropes and insisted he be tied for better pictures, terror surged through him. He bolted, ran through the brush, and never looked back. Detectives slid a lineup across the table. The man's finger hovered, then pressed down on one face. "That's him," he whispered. His name was Daniel Owen Conahan. Born in 1954, Conahan had served in the Navy, but his career ended in a cloud of misconduct. He later trained as a nurse, worked in hospitals, and lived a quiet life in Punta Gorda. But behind the mask of ordinariness was an obsession: bondage, domination, and the ultimate act of control: life and death. Detectives began watching him closely. They saw him drive the highways, circling, scanning, pulling over to chat with hitchhikers or men walking alone. To strangers, he was polite, friendly even. But to investigators, it was clear he was hunting. The problem was evidence. Suspicion alone wouldn't hold up in court. They needed a victim who tied him directly to the horrors in the woods. And then, the name Richard Montgomery surfaced. Richard Montgomery's story would become the cornerstone of the case. In April 1996, Richard, just 21 years old, told friends he was meeting someone about making easy money. That was the last time they saw him alive. Weeks later, as skeletal remains were found in a wooded area, the body told the same haunting story: stripped, naked, bound, mutilated with precision. Forensic teams scoured the remains, pulling fibers from the ropes and clothing fragments. When they ran tests, the results struck like lightning. Fibers from Richard's body matched the upholstery in Daniel Conahan's car. Detectives finally had the forensic link they needed. As they delved deeper, more chilling evidence surfaced. A search of Conahan's home revealed ropes, clamps, knives, and photographs of men in compromising positions: nude, tied, posed awkwardly in the woods. Some smiled nervously. Others looked deeply uncomfortable. And most disturbing of all, many of these men were never seen. Again, still, the defense would argue that photographs meant nothing without proof of harm. Prosecutors knew they needed to anchor everything on Richard Montgomery. His case wasn't just strong, it was unshakable. But detectives couldn't ignore the larger question gnawing at them. How many of the men in those photographs had shared Richard as fate? How many shallow graves lay hidden in the scrubland, waiting for discovery? The Hog Trail murders, as the media called them, were no longer just whispers. They were a terrifying reality. But the man responsible still walked free, coolly denying everything, even as the evidence piled against him. The day detectives served the search warrant on Conahan's home, the air was tense inside. They found what they expected and what they feared: ropes, medical instruments, pornographic material. That blurred the line between fantasy and violence. Every item was a window into his desires, and every window looked out on a horror. When Conahan sat in the interrogation room, his demeanor was unnerving, calm, flat. He crossed his arms, stared at the table, and denied everything. They agreed, he said. It was consensual. Nobody got hurt. But detectives pressed harder. One leaned in, voice steady and low. Then where are they? Daniel, where's Richard? Where are the men in those photographs? Silence. Outside the room, the community was gripped with fear. The woods that had once been a place for hunting and fishing now carried an ominous weight. Parents warned their sons not to talk to strangers. Drifters whispered about a man who cruised the highways offering money that turned into death. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they focused their case on Richard Montgomery. The Hog Trail murders numbered more victims than they could prove. But Richard's case gave them a clean forensic link. If they could convict Conahan for one murder, they could put him away for the rest of his life or end it entirely. The stage was set, and the courtroom would soon become the arena where Daniel Conahan's fate was decided. The trial opened with an almost suffocating silence. Families of the missing filled the benches, clutching photographs of sons and brothers who had vanished without a trace. All eyes locked on the man sitting at the defense table, his expression blank, his posture rigid. Daniel Conahan. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They showed jurors the photographs of men tied up in the woods. They displayed the ropes, clamps, and surgical instruments seized from his home. They brought in forensic experts who explained how fibers from Conahan's car matched those found on Richard Montgomery's remains. One of the most powerful testimonies came from the young man who had escaped Conahan's ropes. He described the terror in his chest. The moment he realized the stranger's intentions weren't harmless. If I hadn't run, he said, voice cracking, I'd be dead like the rest. The defense countered by portraying Conahan as eccentric, but not violent. They argued the photographs were consensual, that Richard could have been killed by someone else. But the jury wasn't swayed. After hours of deliberation, the verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder. When the judge pronounced the sentence death, the courtroom was a battlefield of emotion. Some families wept with relief, others with grief. Justice had been served for Richard Montgomery. But justice for the others, those still missing, still unidentified, remained elusive. And as Conahan was led away in shackles, he didn't speak a word. No remorse, no apology. Just the cold, empty stare of a predator who had finally been caged. Today, Daniel Conahan sits on Florida's death row, his fate sealed by the conviction and death sentence handed down in 1999. He has spent decades appealing, but his silence remains his most chilling trait. He has never confessed, never acknowledged the pain he caused, never given closure to the family still waiting for answers. Investigators believe his crimes go far beyond Richard Montgomery. They suspect as many as 20 or more young men may have fallen victim to him. Their remains scattered along hog trails and scrubland across Florida. But nature reclaims its secrets, and many of those men may never be identified. The Hog Trail murders remain a wound on Florida's history, a reminder of how predators can walk unnoticed among us, preying on the forgotten and the vulnerable. Conahan never earned the infamy of Dahmer or Gacy, perhaps because his victims were men on the margins, drifters, runaways, young men without powerful voices to speak for them. But that silence makes the tragedy even more haunting for the families. Closure is a word that will never ring true. They live with the unanswered questions, the absence of sons and brothers, the empty spaces at tables and holidays. Conahan may face execution one day, but the real punishment is eternal. His name will forever be tied to the shadows of Florida's woods, where bones still whisper of lives stolen. Because men like Daniel Conahan don't just kill, they erase. They prey upon the lost, the unseen, the forgotten, and in doing so, they remind us that monsters don't live under beds or in childhood nightmares. They live among us, and sometimes they're the neighbor you never thought to fear.